Welcome to UX and Coffee with Jen and Lauren. Welcome, Lauren.
Hello.
I feel like this one's getting boring, although it is my favorite coffee mug. But if I go back and look at these videos, I've probably used this
Is
with
it the same one?
majority. Yeah, I love this one. It might have been at the first UX and Coffee when I used it too. I bought it in I forget if it was Copenhagen or Amsterdam. I was staying at an Airbnb and they had the best, like I love stuff like this. It's like I'm so functional when I travel and buy things. Like I buy very functional things like mugs or plates or blankets, like very functional things when I
Mhm.
travel. I was on an Airbnb and I loved the cups, the mugs, and I messaged the woman who was hosting, and she told me where to go, what store, and I didn't find those exact ones, but I found this cutesy one. Isn't
It
this
is super cute. My
yeah?
first thought though is how do you get it home?
Well,
Like
I
you
buy like
cups and
one.
mugs and travel and I'm just immediately like I would break something.
Yeah, I buy like one. I don't buy like China set of 12 or something.
She's got antiques in her book bag.
Exactly, exactly. Well, thank you so much for joining today. I'm so excited to talk to you and have you here today. For those that don't know, Lauren and I have known each other for a really long time
Yes.
and through lots of UX activities. And so it's fun to be hosting you today and having a chat about deliverables and working with stakeholders, things that come up all the time, with my coaching clients, with my students, even with people who are kind of senior level, not super senior,
Hmm.
but it seems to be that thing that changes junior to senior level. It's really like
Yeah.
communicating with stakeholders and storytelling. So I'm excited. And you and I have talked a bunch about it. So excited to share with others what we think about this today.
Yes, I love it. And I think you're right on point on that with the junior to senior. And also I think it depends on experience. Some people come into the research realm through academics and they have a very different take on these types of documents and how these things are shared out. And then others are self-taught. And some have been teams of one for 15 years. And so maybe you have a ton of experience, but not as much exposure to other things in the industry. And it all affects how you do these types of deliverables. So
Yeah.
thank you for having me. Yeah, we met, I want to say like in, I think it was 2012, through a UXPA event. So it's been, I think, 12 years now,
Amazing.
or so, somewhere around there.
Oh,
And then I
when
ended up
we met, Lauren, you were hosting. It wasn't even UXPA. It was SoFlux,
SoFlex.
South Florida
Yes,
UX. Yeah. And Corey and I were down there for something else, like a UXPA board meeting or something. And then we came to your event. That was when we
yes,
met.
that is exactly right. So SoFlex is the South Florida UX meetup that I started back in 2008. I somewhat retired it. I've moved to Columbus, where we're now CBUX, the Columbus UX, working with the IXCA group there. But SoFlex is such a fantastic community and still is. Jonathan Montebello, sorry, John, if I'm not saying your last name right. Um, Monty is kind of heading that up now in South Florida. So yes, that was a very cool initial connection, and then I ended up joining UXPA as a board of director. I want to say around 2016, which was such an awesome experience.
Yeah. Awesome. And can you share with your fans, can you share a bit more about your path and where you are now?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in art and computers and psychology, and I built websites back in the what was it called? Tripod GeoCities days, right? Like I was so cool because I had a GeoCities website. And then got into how do you build these things? And I was like, oh, HTML and tables, and I could code table rows and table cells and make pretty designs. But I always got stuck between pretty and functional and useful, and ended up going to private art school. Then I left private art school and went to get my developer's degree, computer information systems degree. And then I got my first job, still bouncing between the two, and I had a fantastic manager, Kendra Ryan, who said, there's this conference out in Seattle. I'm not really sure what it is. It's called NNG or something like that. Would you like to go with me? This was, I'm going to say 2006. And I was like, yeah, sure, let's check it out. And I came back and I was like, this is my purpose. This is what I've been looking for. This is the intersection of design and computers and psychology, and dove in headfirst. And I'm a super geek about it. And so almost 20 years now that I've been just super geeking out on everything UX design and research. Um, yeah, that's kind of a high level.
Awesome. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, these past couple of years, you've really gotten into education.
Very much.
Do we call it ed tech?
Yes, ed tech. So I've always been interested in education. At one point, I wanted to be a teacher, and big high fives and props to all the teachers out there. It is a very hard, somewhat thankless job with a lot of internal motivation, but not a lot of external motivation and pay. And I'm sad to say I was maybe selfish enough to decide that that was not going to be great pay. And so I just never went that direction. But then I was also very delighted to be able to dive back in. After I got my master's, I was able to teach at FIU. I taught human factors there for a little bit. And then I was approached by Nearpod to join their group, excellent group over there, and work in ed tech, where you can design software for teachers to use. So it was a great way for me to feel like I could be part of the teacher community while not necessarily being a teacher. I don't know if would have actually been a good teacher. Now that I have two kids, I can't imagine directing 20 of them at the same time. Like that was a lofty vision or goal when I was very young. But I'm doing my part. So I worked at Nearpod, and now I work at Seesaw, which is a fabulous ed tech company. So education technology, and Seesaw is kindergarten through second grade, primarily tools for these young little learners who use technology, but in a very different way. So something that's often taken for granted is a lot of my users can't read. You think about how much you read on an interface, and that's a very key point. If your users can't read, how do you direct them around the interface, and how do you use iconography and things that will resonate with them when they're learning? But it's great because little ones are also fabulous explorers.
Fascinating. I feel like we can have so many things. I mean, I feel like we can have a whole discussion about that and even
Research.
exactly and how you approach research when you learn something like that maybe you didn't even know or consider going in, right? But then you realize like, oh, wait a minute, here we are designing for, essentially people who read. There's so much text on so many of our products. And then it's like, wait a minute, that's not going to work for this population.
Exactly. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it is interesting. I think the majority of researchers I've worked with have a very standard adult population, especially in B2B and e-commerce. But there's definitely a lot of people out there who have more interesting participants, like young ones. We have to think about how we use our scripts and think about how we manage our time. Young ones, we need to think about their attention span. Maybe with some older their interest in telling long stories. Both are very different time requirements on how we treat our scripts.
Right, right. Okay, I would love to talk more about that. Even talking about like different audiences. I've done some work with older adults, right? And you're making me think about that. But our time will go quickly. Let's talk about what we intended to talk about today, which was more around the lines of deliverables and stakeholder engagement. And I think you had a couple questions to kind of prompt that.
Yeah. Let's see where to start. I think a good topic is how we share our findings, and then how we get to the point that we're sharing our findings. Are people reading your findings who have been involved in the research, who have been brought along in the journey? Are people reading your findings who have no idea what you've been working on? Do you create different documents for both? One document? Do you create a document at all? How do you socialize this? We recently went through some stuff at Seesaw. We were looking through some older documentation, and there was an 80-page Word doc around an area that we were investigating on the library. And then we recently did some follow-up research, which I think was a 36-ish page Google Drive, Google PowerPoint, what am I trying to say? Google Slides. Two very different types of research deliverables, essentially the same research task.
Right. Yeah, this actually is not that different from what we were just talking about, because when we think about our deliverables, we have to think about our audience. So whether we're creating an interface for people. We need to think about who the audience is, if there are different types of audiences, and we need to display information differently for children, for older adults.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, to me, a similar thing when it comes to deliverables. Who is the audience and how are they going to consume the content? If you're giving a readout, or I should say an update to like super senior level VP, they do not want that 80-page document. No.
I don't have time to read it.
What do I need to know? They don't even want to know the methods. They might poke holes and ask some questions like how many people and what did you do? But I find super senior level people are just like, what do I need to know to improve the product? Because that's their goal, right? They're working on business things. They need to keep on moving. They do not need all the nitty-gritty details. Whereas the research team, the design team, the people who are actually, have their hands in it and are working on things, they probably want more details, right? So it really depends on who you're presenting to, what their expectations are, how they're going to consume content. If you have a bunch of engineers that you're working with, they may be more, or quantitative researchers, they may be more into the data. They want to know the nitty-gritty details and the quantitative side of things, right? And like the combination of data from data science and from the UX research and putting it all together. And what is that story? So it really depends on who you're presenting to, how they're going to consume the information. Because ultimately, in my mind, it doesn't matter. If I need to retell my story in a different way, 5 different ways, I don't really care as long as people are consuming it, right? The worst thing that can happen is you do all this great research and it sits on a shelf. Anybody who's been doing research, that we know that we've all been there where we've done this great research and it's like, what's going on? Why is it sitting on the shelf? Maybe the team was moving quickly and they've already moved on. We don't want that to happen. So this comes back to one of your other questions about like how often or how early. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but it's like, do you give a few nuggets along the way because the team is moving fast? And if you don't give them nuggets along the way, they're not going to wait 4 weeks for research findings. They're already working on it. They're already hypothesizing how to improve it. And if you're not giving them research findings along the way, they're moving forward without the research findings, which then it's not truly a user-centered product because they're just creating in ways that make sense to them. But, arguably there's a piece in there that's our fault because we're not getting them the findings fast enough.
Yeah.
So like to me, and when you're doing all of the planning up front, you have your kickoff meeting, you have your roadmap, what's taking place when, over communicating at that stage, at all the different stages, and finding out what those expectations are, finding out what the timelines are of the development team. Do they need your findings along the way? Because they're moving quickly, right? So like, that's a cue to me. If my development team is telling me about some deadline that is like pretty close to when my research project is going to be done, that's a cue to me that I need to get them feedback along the way. If it's something else where it's like, well, this is a little bit, and this rarely happens, right? But it's like, this is on the back burner. We're not actually going to start making changes for another month, then it's a little different. Then it's like, okay, I don't need to give them the findings immediately because they have other things that are more pressing between now and when they actually need the findings.
I think that's a good point though, because you can't look at a stakeholder and create a persona around the stakeholder. I think you have to create a persona in a sense around the goals of the project, because to your point, there may be a project that's a bit more strategic, a bit more visionary or long standing, and we want to understand the space and we want to look at some strategy stuff longer term. We want to spend a little bit more time on it, dig a little bit deeper, give us a little bit more thorough analysis. And then there's other projects, could be the same stakeholder. We need to know if this is working or not, because dev is picking it up in 3 weeks and we need to run. And so even though you're at the same size company, whether it's enterprise or a startup, and you have the same stakeholder, the goals of that project are going to do a lot to determine how you read that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you have these projects in parallel. They're happening at the same time. You've got this one massive study where you're conducting a survey and you're conducting interviews and you're creating user personas, right? Like, and that's something that can wait a little while. You don't have to give little nuggets along the way. But then you have this other thing where it's like, is this change, is it working? Did we fix an issue we had? And giving that feedback as you have it is really wise, in my opinion. Maybe you're not doing it after every participant. Maybe you're doing it at the end of the day. You have 3 sessions today. at the end of the day, a couple quick bullets about what we learned today. You can have the caveat in there that we only have 3 people. The themes are emerging, or they're going to be emerging. So, take this with a grain of salt, but we wanted to update you on what we learned today. Because the risk, if you update after every participant or at the end of every day, the risk is you have a super senior person in the company. That's the only thing they read. They're not at your final readout. They're not attending sessions. They only get this little nugget. And now they hinge all of their decisions on that little nugget. So you want to make sure you caveat it too, and just say, we're still running participants. We expect themes to emerge. We'll be organizing this, thematically, but here's what we learned so far, especially when they're like really juicy nuggets. Like,
Yes.
that could be positive or negative, right? It could be like, there was a showstopper. This is only one participant, but they could not get past this problem. That's worthy of sharing. Why do you need to wait 4 weeks to say, hey team, we have a showstopper? Or conversely, like, guys, we had this participant who absolutely loved this new thing, that you all just created. Like, why not share that?
Especially those positive nuggets.
Like,
yeah.
Awesome job, team.
I think you remind me of 2 things. The first one being concise, clear feedback. Because if you're sharing early and often, that's great. But if I'm sharing a page long Slack message every afternoon, it's going to become an overshare in the wrong way where people just glaze past it and then nobody's ever reading, right? So it's those really concise, really sweet nuggets, I think, as you said. But then also the clarity of those shares. This was, to your point, I think that's a very good point to reiterate. This was 3 participants. We have 5 more to go. These could be the 3 that really lean this direction and the other 5 really lean the other direction. We aren't sure yet. And not sharing that as a summation as if it's done, because then it's too easy for those on the outside to take that as fact and as final, and just being really clear about how much data is there.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe a way around that is when you are giving your little update, whether it's by person or end of day, to keep that really short, right? Like, here is one big thing. Here's one issue that came out of the session, and here's one positive thing. And that's it, right? It's not really a synthesis of what occurred during the session or across the sessions, right? But it's more along the lines of like, here's a juicy little nugget, because the benefit of doing that, and I'm a big proponent of it, the benefit of that is you're bringing your stakeholders along the journey with you. We are not operating in silos, which happens way too often in our industry, where we're tasked, we align, and then we go off into the other room, and now we're there for weeks conducting our research, right? We're not bringing our team along with us. Everybody's busy. Everybody has their own job to do. And if we're not bringing them along with us, they may forget that we're even doing research. They may forget what we're doing research on. They're moving along. These companies hire really smart people who have lots of ideas. So if we're not bringing them along the journey with us, they're not waiting. They're going to keep on moving, right?
I think that brings up a good point, which is you're doing research for the experience, but you're also providing an experience with your research. So thinking about how you're providing that experience. Is it exhausting? Is it short? Is it quick? Is it accessible? Is it easy to get to? Is it referenceable? What is the experience like for your research consumers? And that makes me think of images. I think images are one of those images, I mean, like almost like visuals, data, graphics, things that you create or partner with maybe a designer to create. They look simple. And just like anything that looks simple, if it's done well, it was probably complicated and hard to create. But they're so absolutely powerful. I think when you have the time to create a really good graphic around your insights, or a journey map, or a stoplight chart, or a rainbow, like there's persona, whatever it is, an image speaks 1,000 words, right? Throwing something up like that people can pass down and look at and resonate with quickly will go so far, but it's a lot of additional work to be able to put those together, to craft those. Something else you made me think of with those quick share outs is, I think, humanizing it as much as we can. It's easy to take research as, not that it's not human, but it's these personas, it's these abstract, people. It's Penny the payroll, whatever. And I think you can humanize those outcomes if you're doing quick shares. Can you tell I worked in payroll for a little while? And today we talked to two teachers. One was a pull-out teacher who helps students who are having trouble with their learning. And the second is a fully embedded classroom teacher who has 22 students, and half of the students have a one-to-one device and the other half of the students don't. And three of them have learning difficulties. And here's how here's the quick bullet points from each. You're creating real people, I think, which for developers can be super beneficial because they tend to be most removed in a company, I think, from your actual users. And I think being able to paint like real people and humanizing that can be really insightful.
Yeah. You just made me think of another point of why it's really important to bring people along. So something that UX researchers often forget, and it seems weird to forget this, but we all do it because again, we're just like doing our job. We are a direct connection with users of a product. And so many people in the company are not. They think they know what people need, and they may have data. Data scientists, for example, have access to a ton of data. They're still not talking to the people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not understanding the why. And that's the power of a UX researcher. I'm so grateful that all these companies are investing after all the layoffs we had. Now there's all this hiring taking place. And it's like, yes, because we're a direct connection to users. Yes. And you can't forget that. And that's another important reason to share out findings frequently, share them out often. What was the other thing you made me think of? Oh, combining. So just because a research project is done doesn't mean the findings are done. Your next research project, you might learn more or have like a larger sample now of something you already previously learned. Bring back in that old report. When you're reporting the findings on study number 2, let's say, it's a great idea to say, this is consistent with what we learned in study number 1. Right? Or this is consistent with what we learned in 5 studies. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully by study 3, people are like, okay, this is a thing we need to pay attention to. But like bring that back in. So it's another way to give face time, if you will, to your previous research. And the fact that you're learning things over and over that are consistent. We often have small samples in our studies. That's more reason why we should be saying this is consistent with that study, This is consistent with external literature, right? Like this isn't new. Call attention to that.
Yeah. And I think that makes me think of 2 things as well. The first being an impact report, and the second being that business connection. So Scott Birkin asked a question about executives who maybe don't read your findings or ask for a lot of research, but then don't do anything with it. And the first few thoughts that come to mind is, number 1, do you have an executive summary? Because if I have an executive, like a high-level executive, I don't expect them to read my report. I expect them to read the first page, and that's about it. And that needs to really summarize the key takeaways and tie to what's the ROI here? What are the numbers? There should be a number in there somewhere. What is this research helping or informing or doing, or how is this going to help the business? How is this information going to propel us forward in our strategy or our goals? But then even if it's maybe not the research you've done right now, but you're trying to show the value of the research you've done in the past, having some sort of impact sheet where you can say, okay, we did some research back in, 2021 around this. And when I go back retroactively and I look at what happened from that research led to 2 design projects. It led to 3 new feature releases. It led to increased NPS or CSAT scores. It led to go back and look at your old research, because research is sometimes so far ahead. It could be a year or 2 later before the full outcomes can be realized from that research. Go back and document what some of the things that snowballed into success that kicked off through your initial research, and show how that initial work really led to value and cost savings down the road.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that approach. I also think finding other people who are proponents of your research. So you have a super senior exec who says they want research. They're not reading the findings. They're not really paying attention. Who else can be an ally? I had an experience where I was presenting to a super senior person, and he continued to say, you're using the wrong methods, right? Or you're not talking to the right people. Like every time I brought research findings, he had something to say about why my findings were not valid. And it was like, I was cringing because I was like, okay, like I had to, my ego was bruised. I wanted to be like, do you know who you hired?
It's almost like denial. I feel like maybe just from your description, like maybe this person wasn't hearing what they wanted to hear.
Well, exactly. It was his baby and it wasn't performing well. Right. And So my first tactic was multi-method. Like, let me show that this is a problem in different kinds of methods. Next approach was different types of users, current users, novice users. Let me show that this is a really complicated interface that people do not understand. My last tactic, which was the most effective, I brought in an external researcher, a super senior person who was able to communicate with him in a way that was effective. She honestly was sharing my research findings and I didn't care. I didn't care. It's like there are times when you have to put your ego on the shelf.
Yeah.
Because our job is to conduct good research, number one, sound research, no confounds, no biases, reducing all those things. So we're conducting really good research, number one. Number two, communicate those findings and make sure the message is getting across. My job is not to, pump myself up and excel or push my own career forward. Like, no, I've been hired by this company to do a job, and that's the thing I need to do. So if it means bringing in an external person who's going to be a talking head to just talk about my research findings, and that works, sure. We can spend the money on bringing in an external person. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to, go that route, and that's totally fine. So it's like figuring out the best way to communicate with people. Finding an internal ally has worked for me as well. In some of these bigger tech companies that I've worked at, it's like, how do I communicate with that person, that really, really tough person who's critical about everything, which, by the way, sometimes that's good. We need that critical person who's poking holes in everything. But, how do I communicate with that person? And finding internal allies who have a good relationship with that person or know how to communicate with that person, that tends to work really well too.
I love that external though, because I feel like it shows a good understanding of the bias, right? And as soon as you're internal or as soon as you're on a longer term contract, there becomes a bias to your information that you're in-house, right? And people externally always seem to, in our minds, be the expert. They know more, even though they may know less than the people internally. And so I think leveraging that bias to your benefit is a very wise and smart play. I love that.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful. I enjoy it. It's also, I just said it's not about the ego, but it also is validating. It's like you bring in an external person who's like, I wouldn't have done anything differently. And it's like, okay, good. Because I was starting to feel a little dumb there. Like, thank you.
I'm sure there's in-house people who may be listening who are going, oh my God, if I could have a penny for every consultant we've hired to do what I did last year.
Right? Yeah. Right? It's wild. But whatever, that's how it is. And back to the whole thing. It's like figuring out how to communicate, figuring out the storytelling. Oh, let's talk about storytelling.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So research deliverables. We talked about how frequently and different formats, right? Like a couple bullets about, these three participants or what we learned today. But what about the final deliverable? If there is a final deliverable, what does that look like? So this is an area where, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning, where I see a lot of people struggle. It's like the storytelling aspect. And my recommendation there is practice, 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 have people review, get feedback. Like you have to actively work on your storytelling. Think about a book, think about a novel. Most people did not get it right that first time. Most, if maybe none, right? People don't get it right the first time. And the way you get better at writing, the way you get better at storytelling is to continue doing speaking. Think about speaking on the stage. It's like the first time I ever did it, probably you, probably anybody on this call. The first time was like, you're nervous and you don't really know. And then you get feedback and you make it better and you might give that talk again in the future and it's 10 times better. Like the only way to improve is to continue to work on it and to get feedback. This is no different. It's storytelling. It's taking your research finding. Researchers, we think everything is important. We want to put everything in the deck.
It's so true.
It's all important. So it's like, how do we organize that information into a cohesive story that is exciting? It's engaging. People want to read it. People want to act on it. What does that storyline look like? How do we go from here was the problem, here's what we did, here's what we learned, and now what do you do with it, right? Like that's kind of our arc of our storytelling, but then succinctly being able to take research findings and talk about what the issue is and how we know it's an issue, right? That's the part people struggle with. Some people will say like, task 1, this is what happened. Task 2, this is what happened. It's like, that's not storytelling. You're just spitting out the data you have. But your job as a researcher is now like across the tasks. What were the common themes? Where was there a language issue across all the tasks, which is like a language issue on the entire interface potentially, right? It's like, what is the theme across all those tasks? That's where it gets hard. And I think
go ahead.
I think part of it is confidence. I think people don't know how to do it. So it's actually easier to just report the facts, which we need to report the facts when we're conducting research. But then when we synthesize it into themes, that's where, that's the part that takes a little bit of practice.
I think that's the key. And that's what I was just thinking of. There's, I think, maybe a more junior aspect to reporting on. We did a task. This was a task. It's like, now you may have a more quantitative study where that is an important way to do it. But for those more qualitative kind of insights and themes, there's a large analysis step that has to happen where you take information across participants and you group it and you collate it. I don't know if that's not the right word I'm looking for, but you create all these themes and insights that come from the themes that require you to move the data around, take it away from the task at hand and take it away from the specific person and put it all together in a jumble. I think that analysis, being good at that and practicing that, improves the storytelling, because you can kind of create that arc and understand what the priorities were, what the biggest insights were, what the biggest findings were, instead of organizing it just in the way that it was done.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can have another chat about that and actually show that.
Ooh,
it's like you take all the findings, classic stickies on the wall. You could do it now digitally as well. Like, how do you take all these findings? You've got so many. And now how do we start to pare it down and find those themes?
Yeah, which gets into, if maybe we do that on another one, I think something that came up with us recently is the way that you take your notes. If you've got 30 or 40 or 50 pages of just long running notes of every single thing a person said and everything they clicked and everything they did, it's going to be really hard to go back through and find those key behaviors or those key sticky points. And it's also going to take you forever to transcribe every motion and movement and comment. So I think that's a really interesting thing, is learning how to be a good note taker in your own research, and then how that then leans into the way you do your analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the time always flies. We're over. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so great. Always awesome to talk to you. Can you tell
Yes, I loved it.
they can find you?
Yes, Lori Lue, Lorielue is pretty much where I am on anything social. And I'm also going to be speaking at UXPA in June on bias in research and design. So I'm glad you brought that one up. Yeah, that's pretty much where you can find me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Take care.